If you have ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you're going to start your own podcast or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. Both links will be in the episode description if you are interested. A royal marrying for love is not a new concept. But if you were a royal in 16th century Tudor England, marrying for love is not something that you should have expected. Many royal marriages during this time were arranged marriages, and they were arranged for a number of reasons. Sometimes they were arranged to help create or strengthen an alliance between two countries. Or they were arranged to give money and or resources to a country. But even if you were a royal in 16th century Tudor England, if you were promised that you could marry for love, you would expect for that promise to be honored, right? Especially if that promise was given to you by your beloved older brother. Hi, I'm Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 6th episode of the first season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. For the first season of this podcast, I am talking about something that I find to be very interesting, and that's Tudor history. Now, when I think of Tudor history, the first person that comes to my mind is King Henry VIII. But I'm not talking about him per se. Rather, I'm focusing in on his inner circle and the people he was an asshole to. And as I go along this season, you will find there was a lot of overlap between his inner circle and the people he was an asshole to. And for this week, I am talking about Mary Tudor, Queen of France. Mary Tudor, Queen of France, was the youngest sister of King Henry VIII. Not to be confused with his daughter Mary Tudor, who I will get to later on this season. Mary was the daughter of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Her siblings were Arthur, Margaret, and Henry, in that order. Mary was born on March 18th, 1496. As a child, Mary was given the proper education one would expect that a princess would be given. She was taught multiple languages, embroidery, music, and dancing. And oh, how she loved to dance. She enjoyed entertaining guests. The beautiful princess also enjoyed spending time with her beloved older brother, Henry. They were incredibly close. And maybe that closeness is just what makes his broken promise just that much more heartbreaking. Mary's father had first arranged a marriage for Mary and Archduke Charles. Archduke Charles was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. Catherine of Aragon was King Henry VIII's future first wife. Charles would go on to later become Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Mary and Charles were engaged in 1507. Mary was 11 years old and Charles was 7. But it was a marriage that would never be. In 1514, Mary's brother Henry, now King Henry VIII, had called off the engagement. But he quickly arranged another marriage for Mary. He arranged for her to marry King Louis XII of France. Mary wasn't thrilled about the idea of marrying King Louis XII. The age of Louis XII may have had something to do with Mary's reluctance to marry the king. Mary was 18 and King Louis XII was 52 years old. But there was also another reason why Mary didn't want to marry King Louis XII. Mary was in love with someone else. She had fallen in love with King Henry VIII's best friend, Charles Brandon. So Mary came up with a plan. She agreed that she would marry Louis XII, but if she outlived him, she would get to pick her next husband. Her brother agreed to the terms. And so Mary married King Louis XII on October 9th, 1514. Mary had 4 English ladies-in-waiting follow her to France. One of the ladies was King Henry VIII's future second wife, Anne Boleyn. Remember her? She was the subject of this season's second episode. King Louis XII was infatuated with his new, young, and beautiful bride. He called her a nymph from heaven, and the people of the French court were equally captivated by Mary's beauty and charm. But Mary wasn't quite taken with King Louis XII. She just held on to the promise that after King Louis XII died, she could choose her next husband. And Mary didn't have to wait very long. On January 1st, 1515, King Louis XII died. It was rumored that he died because his new wife was just too much for him in bed. Now, while I would love to sit here and tell you that's exactly how King Louis XII died, because it's just so juicy and so scandalous, but it was probably gout that took King Louis XII out. Mary had to stay in France to see if she was pregnant, but she wasn't. She also had to stay inside because in France it was custom for the widow to stay inside for 1 month after her husband's death. After the death of King Louis XII, many wanted to marry Mary. And despite his promise, King Henry VIII wanted to find someone for Mary to marry so he could keep the French alliance. But Mary remembered her brother's promise and the love that she had in her heart. So Henry sent Charles Brandon off to France to go get Mary, but made Charles promise not to propose to Mary. Charles Brandon agreed. Before he got to France, friars tried their hardest to turn Mary against Charles. They said that he and Cardinal Thomas Wolsey performed witchcraft together. But there was nothing anyone could say or do that would turn Mary against Charles. When Charles got to France, Mary Tudor was going to make sure that she got her end of the deal. She convinced Charles Brandon to marry her in a small ceremony in Paris. There were only 10 people in attendance, including the new King of France, King Francis I. It was treason to marry without the king's consent, and despite Henry's word to his sister that she could pick her next groom, King Henry VIII was furious at Mary and Charles. There was even talk that Charles Brandon may be imprisoned or even executed. But instead, with the intervention of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the couple was ordered to pay a fine. They were ordered to pay 200,000 pounds of her dowry, all of Mary's jewels and gold plate King Louis XII gave her, and 24,000 pounds that were to be paid in yearly 1,000 pound installments. That is the equivalent to 7.2 million pounds today. But that fine was eventually reduced. The couple only ended up paying £1,324. And the couple got to officially be wed on May 13th, 1515, at Greenwich Palace, this time with the blessing of King Henry VIII. Things between Mary and Henry got better. Henry even went on to name his daughter after his sister. And as for Mary and Charles, they settled into a happy married life. Charles was married twice before, and he had 2 daughters from his second wife, Anne and Mary, and Mary loved and treated them as her own. Mary and Charles had 4 children together, a son named Henry, daughters Frances and Eleanor, and a second son named Henry. They named him Henry in honor of their first son that died. But the relationship between Mary and Henry didn't stay pleasant for long. It soured again when Henry wanted to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Mary loved Catherine, and she hated Henry's new love interest, Anne Boleyn. Mary even spoke publicly about how she hated Anne and that she supported Catherine. This caused a feud between the Boleyns and Brandons, and that feud led to a fight, and that fight led to the death of one of Charles Brandon's relatives. King Henry VIII pardoned the murderers. This made Mary furious, and Mary and Henry were unable to patch up their relationship before Mary died on June 25th, 1533. The cause of Mary's death is uncertain, but she had been sickly her whole life. Mary's funeral was on July 20th, 1533. She is buried at St. Edmund's Abbey. But even though Mary is dead and gone, her legacy still lives on. Mary has been depicted in many fictional novels, and those novels are When Knighthood Was in Flower by Edwin Caskoden, The Reluctant Queen by Mary Costain Haycraft, Mary, Queen of France by Jean Platty, Princess of Desire by Maureen Peters, Rose of England by Hilda Lewis, Heart of a Rose by Hilda Lewis, The Secret Bride by Diane Hager, The Last Boleyn by Karen Harper, and Three Sisters, Three Queens by Philippa Gregory. Mary was also depicted in the movie The Sword and the Rose, and the 2 television series The Spanish Princess and The Tudors. Although in The Tudors she's depicted a little differently. Instead of marrying the King of France, in The Tudors she marries the King of Portugal. And instead of being named Mary Tudor, she's named Margaret Tudor. And her sister Margaret is nowhere to be seen in the series. The creators of the show didn't want to cause confusion for the audience by having 2 Marys in the show. Although, personally, as someone who has seen every episode of The Tudors, I think the audience would have got by just fine with 2 Marys in the show. But Mary's legacy not only lives on in fiction, but it lived on in real life. For fellow Tudor history fans and history fans in general, which I'm going to assume if you're listening to this podcast, you're at least the latter, you might find this interesting to know that Mary Tudor is the grandmother of Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen. She is also a direct ancestor of the current Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II. And that was the life of Mary Tudor, Queen of France. Thank you so much for listening to the 6th episode of the first season of History Shelf. There are 15 episodes planned for this season. Next week's episode is going to be about George Boleyn. I hope you come back for that. A few things before I go. This podcast has social media. This podcast has an Instagram. It's at history_shelf_pod. If there's ever a time when you're listening to one of these episodes and you're thinking, I wonder what these people look like, hop on over to this podcast's Instagram, because each week I post pictures of the people that I am talking about. This podcast also has a Twitter. It's at HistoryShelfPod. I would love it if I could connect to my listeners on social media. Also, this podcast has merch. I created a store on Teesprings. If you hop on over to this podcast's Twitter, underneath the bio is a link to the Teespring store. I'm having some issues with the accessory bag. For some reason, it's coming out all black, but I'm working with Teesprings to help fix that. The accessory bag is supposed to be a Catherine of Aragon inspired bag, and it's supposed to be light purple and in black writing has humble and loyal. Hopefully by the time that I post this episode, it will be fixed. But as of right now, everything else is good to go. You can buy it now. Also, this podcast has a Patreon. I have tweeted out a link to this podcast's Patreon. Please don't feel obligated. It is just there if you want to give. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks to becoming a Patreon of this podcast, including helping me pick out the theme for the next season of this podcast. But again, do not feel obligated. There are ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is, of course, to continue to listen to this podcast. Also, if you are listening on a platform where you can rate this podcast, rating it 5 stars would be greatly appreciated. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would help out a great deal. Alright, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.